Operation Rumyantsev opened the final southern movement of the Kursk campaign, and its tone was different from everything that had come before. For weeks, the Red Army had absorbed the German offensive, slowed it through defensive belts, committed reserves at crisis points, and then widened the struggle with counteroffensives. Now, in early August 1943, Soviet forces prepared to strike toward Belgorod and Kharkov, turning the southern face from a defensive battlefield into an offensive launching ground. Rumyantsev matters in the history of armored warfare because it shows the Red Army no longer merely surviving German armored power. It was now using its own combined arms, reserves, artillery, armor, air power, and logistics to dictate pressure and force the Germans into reaction.
If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore.
The operation was named for Pyotr Rumyantsev, an 18th century Russian commander, and like Operation Kutuzov in the north, the name carried historical symbolism. But its real significance lay in what it attempted to do. The German offensive at Kursk had failed, yet German forces still held important ground in the south, including Belgorod and Kharkov. These were not just place names on a campaign map. They were road and rail centers, symbols of control, and anchors for German defenses in eastern Ukraine. If the Soviets could drive through this region, they would complete the transformation of Kursk from a defensive success into a strategic offensive. Rumyantsev was the southern answer to the failure of Citadel. The main Soviet forces came from the Voronezh front under Nikolai Vatutin and the Steppe front under Ivan Konev. These were large army group-level commands, each controlling armies of infantry, tanks, artillery, engineers, and support troops. They had different roles, but together they were meant to break German defenses, exploit toward Belgorod and Kharkov, and prevent the enemy from restoring a stable line. Among the armored forces involved were formations that had already been tested severely during the Kursk fighting, including tank armies that needed repair, reinforcement, fuel, and fresh planning before being thrown back into offensive action. The Red Army had won the defensive phase, but offensive warfare demanded a different discipline. For the Germans, Rumyantsev arrived at a dangerous time. Army Group South, still under Manstein, had fought hard during Citadel and remained capable of skillful defense and local counterattack, but it was now responding to Soviet moves rather than imposing its own. Its armored formations had been worn down, its infantry had suffered, and its reserves were stretched by multiple crises. The Soviet attack in the north against Oral had already forced German attention away from any renewed offensive plan. Now, a major blow in the south threatened to turn the whole post-Kursk position into a retreating battle. Germany could still fight well, but it could no longer easily choose where and when the next major crisis would occur. The opening of Rumyantsev depended on artillery and preparation. Soviet offensives by 1943 increasingly relied on massed fire to break defensive positions, disrupt communications, and open paths for infantry and armor. Artillery did not make the attack easy because German defenses could survive, recover, or shift to secondary positions, but it helped create the conditions for movement. Guns and rocket launchers could strike known strong points, road junctions, artillery areas, and forming positions before rifle units and tanks went forward. This was the offensive mirror of the defensive system at Kursk. Just as mines and anti-tank belts had slowed German armor, Soviet artillery and engineers now had to help Soviet armor pass through German resistance.
Engineers again played a central role. The Red Army could not simply surge forward across a battlefield still full of mines, wrecked vehicles, damaged bridges, trenches, and contested villages. Engineers had to clear obstacles, repair crossings, mark routes, and keep roads usable for the columns behind the attacking troops. This work was especially important because offensive tempo depends on the movement of more than the first wave. Tanks may open a breach, but fuel trucks, artillery, infantry, ammunition, medical units and repair teams must pass through it. If the breach becomes clogged, the offensive slows. Rumyantsev tested whether the Soviet Union could not only build defensive depth, but also sustain forward movement through ground damaged by weeks of battle.
The Soviet armor in Rumyantsev had a different task from the one it faced at Prokhorovka. There, tanks had been committed urgently to halt a German spearhead in a crisis. Now, armored formations were part of a planned offensive meant to break through and exploit. That required coordination with artillery, infantry, reconnaissance, and supply. A tank army had to avoid being thrown too early against intact anti-tank defenses, but it also had to move quickly enough once a gap opened. This balance was difficult. The Red Army's armor doctrine was improving, but not perfect. Soviet commanders could still be blunt, and losses could still be severe. Even so, Rumyantsev showed growing confidence in using armor as part of a broader operational design rather than as an emergency plug. The terrain toward Belgorod and Kharkov shaped the offensive. Roads, rivers, villages, ridges, and rail connections influenced where armored formations could move and where German defenders could delay them. A place that looked small on a strategic map might become important because it controlled a crossing, a road junction, or observation over an approach. German troops knew how to use such features, especially when fighting defensively. They could mine roads, position anti-tank guns, hold villages, and counterattack exposed Soviet spearheads. The Soviet advance therefore had to solve the same kind of problems that had consumed the Germans in July, though now under different conditions and with the strategic initiative on the Soviet side. Air power supported the offensive and added another layer to Soviet pressure. Aircraft could search for German reserves, attack road traffic, support advancing troops, and disrupt artillery or supply positions. The Soviet air forces had grown strong enough to play a major role in such operations, though coordination with the ground battle remained difficult. German aircraft could still threaten Soviet concentrations and interfere with movement. The sky was not uncontested, but the larger pattern had changed. During Citadel, German air power had supported an offensive trying to break Soviet defenses. During Rumyantsev, Soviet air power helped sustain a campaign in which the Red Army was choosing the direction and timing of attack. Logistics became one of the hidden measures of Soviet maturity. An army that has defended successfully must reorganize before attacking. Ammunition has to be moved forward, fuel stocks rebuilt, damaged tanks repaired, replacement crews assigned, roads cleared, and artillery shifted into new firing positions. Wounded men and wrecked vehicles do not disappear just because the operational initiative changes sides. Rumyantsev required the Red Army to transform a defensive battlefield into an offensive base. That transformation was difficult and imperfect, but it demonstrated the scale of Soviet capacity by 1943. The Soviet system could absorb a German offensive, commit reserves, and then gather enough strength to launch a new attack on a major front. German defensive skill made the operation costly. Manstein and his subordinates understood mobile defense, counterattack, and the importance of delaying Soviet exploitation. German units could pull back from exposed positions, hold key points, and strike at Soviet armored formations when they outran support. This prevented Rumyantsev from becoming a simple Soviet sweep. The Red Army's advance would be hard and bloody, with moments of confusion and overextension. But the key change was that German skill was now being used to manage danger rather than create decision. The Wehrmacht was reacting to Soviet blows, trying to preserve coherence while the Red Army widened its success. Rumyantsev also marked a shift in the emotional rhythm of the campaign. Earlier episodes of Kursk were built around waiting, absorbing, and stopping. This one is built around release. The Red Army had endured the German attack and now moved forward with a confidence born of survival and preparation. Yet release did not mean ease.
Offensive operations exposed Soviet troops to mines, machine guns, artillery, anti-tank fire, air attack, and exhaustion. Infantry had to take villages. Tank crews had to move into uncertain ground. Engineers had to work under fire. Commanders had to keep the offensive from outrunning its support. The momentum was Soviet, but the battlefield remained deadly. The operation's importance lies in how it connected the defensive victory at Kursk to the recovery of major territory. Kursk would not have meant the same thing if the Soviets had only stopped Citadel and then paused. Its strategic weight came from what followed. Kutuzov in the north and Rumyantsev in the south showed that Soviet commanders could convert German failure into broad offensive pressure. Rumyantsev aimed at Belgorod and Kharkov, places that would soon become the visible rewards of this change in initiative. The campaign was no longer about whether Germany could cut off a Soviet salient. It was about how far the Soviet offensive could carry before German defenses found another line.
In the history of armored warfare, Rumyantsev shows the other side of Kursk's lesson. Defense in depth had broken German rhythm in July, but victory required the ability to move forward afterward. Tanks, artillery, air power, engineers, infantry, and logistics now had to work not as a shield, but as a moving force. The Red Army was still costly, imperfect, and sometimes harsh in its methods, but it had become capable of sustained mechanized pressure on a scale Germany could no longer match. Rumyantsev opened the final act of the Kursk campaign by proving that the initiative had changed hands. The Soviet Union was no longer waiting for the next German move. It was making the next move itself.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.